And that began to kind of really sort of sink in another way, and certainly a different way than what led me there. And I left the market, and I got in my car and started driving around the community again. But really, I was thinking about the little boy, and I kind of his face was in my mind, and I wasn't really paying too close attention. And I was going up and down the neighborhood, and there aren't any other cars on the road really here. There's very few, and it's mostly dirt. It's unpaved, and I looked in my rearview mirror, and the sheriff was behind me, and I thought, where did he come from? And then I thought, is he following me? And so I turned, and he turned, and I turned, and he turned, and the third time it was evident that he was following me, and that he knew I was not from there, and that it was clear that he did not want me in this community. I mean, I knew enough about this town to know that they really don't want people wandering in. And so he followed me all the way out, down back to the county highway, and made sure I left. And that was when I thought, this isn't how to go about this kind of research. This isn't how to do what I'm trying to do. It is time to leave. But this left a really strong impression on me, both because I just had physically seen polygamy in the 21st century, and I began to realize that maybe the why that I was telling you about earlier, why write historical fiction, why write about Annalisa Young, why revive this? Maybe one of the big whys is that she believed that she had eradicated polygamy from America when the Mormon Church renounced it in 1890, but in fact, she didn't. That the people that I had seen in that community, their ancestors broke away from the church over this very issue so that they could continue to practice polygamy, and it was still playing itself out in the American desert today. And I began to think, so that's really the urgency of her story and the relevance of her story to us today. And then I thought, well, but what am I going to do with that? This is the how. What am I going to do with that? And the more I thought about it, and I thought about that little boy, I thought, well, there's sort of two aspects of polygamy that I'm interested in that are standing out to me. One is being the experience of being a plural wife. But then, because of this trip, I thought, well, there's this whole other experience, and that of being a child of polygamy, and what that would be like. And I began to think of the book as two books, and one would be a historical novel about Annalisa Young, the 19th wife, and then the other would be some kind of story about some kind of kid from this world. But I still wasn't quite prepared to know what that would be, and I didn't know the how. So what I did is, but I was still certain, even more certain, that I did need to speak to some people, and I knew that that kind of visit wasn't the way to do it. And so I contacted some organizations that have helped women and girls leave this community or communities like it, and asked if anybody would be willing to speak to me about their experiences. And they put me in touch with some women who were quite eager to talk about their experiences, women who had grown up in that community and then had become plural wives or communities like it. And they told me really kind of about their lives. And we had long conversations about many, many things. But the more they told me, the more I began to see the world that I wasn't able to see on that trip. Because they would tell me about what their lives were like inside those homes. And then it was from them that I was introduced to a couple of men who had been what's called lost boys. And there's a phenomenon in present-day polygamy of, well, let me back up. People often ask, how do the numbers work? How does the demographics work? That if one man is marrying more than one woman in the community, how does that work? And in the last many years, there's been this phenomenon of that community that I visited and others like it, of kicking out their boys or their young men to make the numbers work so that the elders of the community could marry more women. And so I'd heard about this, and then through these first interviews, I was introduced to a couple of men who had been lost boys, and they told me their experiences, and I thought, this is the story that I want to tell. This is the story that should be my way into this present day story of polygamy. And so I ended up creating a character, a young man who is from a community like that. In the book I call it Mesa Dale, but it's inspired by this community. And his name is Jordan Scott, and he guides the reader through this world. But I wasn't wholly satisfied with those interviews, because I was speaking to people who had left. And that's a different perspective than somebody who lives in there and who hasn't left. And so with a little bit of help from some of these contacts, I went back to the community more than a couple times, and was able to speak to some people, but in what I first thought of as very cursory ways. I still was hopeful that I could get an in-depth interview and something that was as deep as the conversations I'd had with these other people. But I never was able to get very far or very deep, and the conversations weren't especially satisfying to me as a researcher. And I felt frustrated and somewhat like I had failed at this, because I just couldn't get them to open up in a way. And it was important to me because I wanted to write about Jordan's mom. And she's a woman whose faith never cracks. No matter what she has to go through or is asked to do, her faith remains quite strong. And then I stepped back and I thought, you know what, okay, let's look at it this a totally different way. That the women that I'm talking to inside the community, these brief conversations, the wall that they maintain for me and much of the outside world, that in and of itself could tell me about the stalwart quality of their faith, that they have no need to explain it to me or anyone else. And once I began to kind of look at it this way, I began to understand this kind of woman better. And I was able to use that to write that character who became Becky Lynn. I still kind of had to answer that question of how to write this book. A lot is kind of forming. I've got this historical research, I've got these interviews going on for the present day story, but how to weave it all together, and exactly what would this book be? I was still struggling with this. I kind of stepped back and thought, what's been pulling me through all of this the whole way? And I realized that whether I had been doing archival research with newspapers or memoirs or testimonies, or this present day research from these interviews, in every instance, what was pulling me into this material were voices. And the individual voices that came through so strongly, obviously in the interviews, but even in the historical documents, I was finding voices. Even a newspaper article, especially from the 19th century, will have a very strong voice. Or a diary would have a very strong voice, a sermon. And these voices were really what was revealing to me, because this is a very complex story, and there were a lot of contradictions, and that people were telling me things that contradicted each other, and there's historical sources that contradicted each other, and I was struggling with those contradictions. But I realized that the voices kind of explain the contradictions, because through voice you can understand perspective and point of view and one's agenda, or you may be able to pick up on it. And I thought, this is the way to tell the story. That there are two stories, I'll interweave them. I have a lot of different kinds of characters I want to write about, not just the 19th wife, not just Jordan, but I want to write about men who had plural wives, and I want to write about Brigham Young himself, and I want to write about Annalisa's son. And what I could do is do it all in the first person, just different first persons that would let me give the reader, I hope, an experience that began to mimic what I was experiencing in my research, and that would pull the reader into this world in the same way that I've been pulled through these voices. And I began to put that all together, and this whole process took about 15 months. And after about 15 months, I didn't have an outline, but I had a table of contents. And the table of contents was like a road, and it's not that different from the table of contents that ultimately is in the book. And it became kind of a map and a guide of what I was going to do and how the book would unfold. And I obviously adjusted it as I realized certain things in the writing. But it was just one page, and it was on my desk for the next almost 3 years. And it just told me what I would do next and which way the book would go. And that document was just it was very reassuring to me to know what I had to do and what was coming up next. And that all came together, that led to the book, The 19th Wife. I think I'll stop there, and then Yes, I did. That's a good question about point of view and other novels that inspired me. Let me say something first, and then I'll answer that. Early on, when I was doing the research for The 19th Wife, I got very overwhelmed because there's so much historical scholarship on early Mormon history, and it can be very controversial. And but there are people who've devoted their lives to this material, and obviously this subject is very, very important to many people today, Mormons especially. And there was a point where I became extremely nervous about what I was wading into, and I thought to myself, I have to be an expert in all of this in order to write a credible book. And how am I going to be an expert when there are people who've devoted 40 years to scholarly work, and these are the people who could be judging my book, and I would want them to think the book is valid. Now, how am I going to do that? Well, I realized a trick, that I didn't have to be an expert. I shouldn't tell you that, but that what I needed to do is I needed to know as much as my characters would know, and that's enough. I need to know my characters, how they view the world. This is for first person, how they view the world and what knowledge they have of that world. There's some organizations that have helped women and girls leave and adjust to the larger world, and so I made contact with them and asked them if they had any, said I was interested in talking to some people about their experiences. I said I'm writing a book about polygamy. At this point, I wasn't quite sure that I was going to write about present-day polygamy. I still was, The 19th Wife was that main impetus of what I was doing, but I said, is there anyone that you think would talk to me to kind of just give me a sense of their lives and their experiences? And they put me in touch with some people, and they were very helpful, and they were very eager to share their stories. Since the book has come out, other people have written me and said, that's where I come from. Yeah, that's certainly a big question of how you deal with, how close do you stick to fact, when can you break from fact? And I feel like every book is going to present its own set of rules of how to deal with that, because you're going to have some fundamentals laid out of who you're writing about and what's known about them. What I feel like one of the things I want to do in writing historical fiction is get to an emotional truth. something that I feel like the historical record just doesn't offer. It may give us a glimpse, but it may not be a fully complex examination of that person's or these people's emotional truth. And that's where I feel like historical fiction historically has stepped in and what I'm interested in doing. And so ultimately I think what is going to lead me to that emotional truth